This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Social change is the theme of today's show. Freedom varies widely in countries around the world. In some freer societies, like ours, it seems our freedoms are on the decline. In other parts of the world, unfree economies are becoming freer. How does this process work? Why do freedoms increase in some cases and decrease in others? On the first half of the show, we'll speak with an economist who recently published a book on the topic. On the second half, we'll speak with an intellectual entrepreneur that tries to promote greater freedom here in the United States. Joining me now is Dr. Edward Lopez. Dr. Lopez is professor of economics and BB&T Distinguished Professor of Capitalism at Western Carolina University. He's also author of Mad Men, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, The Economic Engine of Political Change, published by Stanford University Press. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, and with your new book that's just come out on this important project of social change and how it occurs in the United States, because we've got these movements around the country. You know, in recent years, we've seen Occupy Wall Street in New York City, and then, of course, the Tea Party movement that's been, you know, kind of going across the middle of the country. And a lot of people think about just, we need to elect the new politicians, the right politician, and everything will change. And when I hear that, I think of one of my favorite commentators from the early 20th century, H.L. Mencken, who talked about politicians under democracy. And what he said was, he put it in a little different context. He said, some people say that the answer is we just have to elect gentlemen to politics and everything will be better. And what he said is, he said, I think that, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think that'll have approximately the same effect as trying to clear the brothels by getting rid of the whores and putting in virgins. He said they'd soon either cease to be virgins or they'd leap out the windows. The same would be true of a gentleman in politics. So I'm always skeptical when people are like, oh, it's just these new politicians we're electing that's going to make it different. That doesn't really work, does it?
Well, you know, Mencken, being one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century, he understands that what you have to look at inside a scenario, be it a brothel or anywhere else, is the incentive structure that ordinary people have when they go about their daily lives in there. Now, that's the way we approach the political world. If you look around, as you mentioned, there are many movements going on. You mentioned the Occupy movement. There's the Tea Party movement. Abroad, we have various types of bottom-up types of social change protests going on, Arab Spring being one of the most conspicuous and perhaps important ones that we've seen in recent years.
Sure. And you and I recently were just in the midst of some of this when we were in Hong Kong together.
That's
and
right.
They have the Occupy Central movement that's going on there.
The Occupy Central movement in Hong Kong is moving for more democratic rights, more rights to elect their own governor in Hong Kong as opposed to having it essentially appointed from Beijing. Now, I think that one of the things that we can do with these various movements is, one thing we can say is that they emerge from this sort of bottom-up forces because there's this widespread sense that people are dissatisfied with the outcomes as they observe them. What we'd like to do, though, is sort of begin by explaining how do those outcomes arrive at this state where people have this widespread dissatisfaction with them. And this is where we come back to your point about Mencken and looking at incentives. The way we sort of structure social outcomes before we can think about social change is that incentives matter. It's an economist's book for starters.
I would expect nothing less from an economist like you.
Yeah. And you know, from then you say, well, incentives matter. Okay. What drives incentives? Well, we have these things called what economists would call institutions, what you can think of as sort of the rules of the game. And then, you know, this is what structures people's incentives to play essentially the game of life one type of way versus another type of way.
Right, and this was with the Mencken point there. If you keep the incentives the same, change the person out. The person's going to act like the other ones. So your book, your model of social change then actually looks at how their incentives get changed by the social structure?
That's right. And the way we examine how incentive structures change is when the rules of the game change, and in turn, the rules of the game are always some embodiment, some instantiation of one set of ideas over another set of ideas. You know, maybe that's a bit of an abstract point, but a good analogy is the sports world.
Okay.
If you look at the sports
We like
world,
sports here in
yeah.
Texas. You know
Oh,
this. You're a native
well,
Texan.
you know, it's a football state. I know that. It's also a basketball state. And, you know, if you look at the game of basketball, take college basketball, for example, we have a rule called the shot clock. And that means if the offense doesn't shoot the ball within 35 seconds, it's a turnover. Well, the shot clock only came in the late 80s because the game of college basketball, coaches and players responding to the incentive structure of there not being a shot clock involved, they played this game called stall ball. Stall ball, which was perfected by the great coach at North Carolina, Dean Smith.
It's four corners.
And you had games ending, you know, championship games ending by the scores of, say, 17-19, and you know nobody was really pleased with this. Spectators were displeased. Coaches were sort of feeling the stigma of playing stall ball, and players weren't having any fun. So a new idea comes along. Let's use a shot clock instead of no shot clock. That idea gets embodied into the rules of the game. Now we have this incentive structure to not play stall ball and instead to play basketball. We can use the sports world as this sort of controlled laboratory, this sort of experiment, if you will, for observing how rules of the game and incentives structure people's behavior and determine outcomes in the real world.
Sure. So kind of tell me about that then. How does it work from the ideas to the changes of the rules of the game to the changes of behavior in the political setting or in our social world?
Okay, so in an open society, you might think of it as ideas do battle with each other. You know, the old adage is ideas matter, but ideas don't matter unless they get implemented into the institutional rules of the game. And so you have some competition. You have some, essentially like a marketplace, if you will, a marketplace of ideas. Going back to the social change movements, the Occupy Wall Street movement, they're advancing ideas of higher income taxes, wealth redistribution, more regulation on industries like finance and banking. But if you look at the Tea Party movement, they're advancing ideas of lesser taxation, less redistribution. These sets of ideas essentially are in competition with each other. And what we get to in our analysis of how the political world works is the set of ideas whose proponents are better entrepreneurs, essentially, in the political world. If they're better political entrepreneurs, they stand a better chance of winning out and having their ideas embodied in the institutional rules. And the rest sort of flows from there. The rules change, the incentives change, the outcomes change.
So your model kind of has its academics at the top who have these competing ideas, but that by itself doesn't win out. There's kind of intellectual entrepreneurs. Actually, you can follow the theme of your book here, right? There's the academic scribblers, then these intellectuals who take those ideas and try to package them and get them through the system in a certain way. And then the madmen, that's the politicians kind of at the bottom, actually end up changing the behavior on the basis of this process.
That's right. Well, let me first say that, you know, we can think of social pressure on political change as coming from the bottom up through these movements, but also as coming from the top down. And so a good example is, you know, in today's world, in 2014, each of us, for the most part, most people are carrying around these little technological miracles in their pockets. These things that can...
I like that phrase. It's a little miracle in my pocket.
That's right. It's a little miracle in your pocket. And one way to sort of impress that point, that it actually is, there's something of a miracle going on here, is to compare how these devices are compared to the way they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I got my first mobile handset.
Really?
And it was about, you know, this thick. I had to hold it out, you know, this far away from my ear just to use it. There was a telescoping antenna. It cost about, in real terms, the same as I paid for my phone, this one here last year. But all it did was voice. The outcomes compared to today were very, very different and arguably not as good. Well, what happened? There was this economist named Ronald Coase who won the Nobel Prize in economics.
His picture's up in the Free Market Institute offices.
Oh, well, that's great because he's a great free market economist and
Yes.
he deserves to have his picture up there with the rest of them. So Coase looks at how the rules of the game were set up for handling the airwaves, the radio frequency spectrum. And he says the old way of doing things, which is the way of doing things at the time he wrote, essentially the federal government would have the say as to who had rights to use the airwaves and exactly in what capacity.
Right.
In the early 90s, the rules of the game changed to reflect Coase's idea, which was that instead of having some bureaucratic process determine who has the rights to the airwaves, let's auction them off to the highest winner. Now, what type of incentives does this introduce? It introduces the incentives, number one, for mobile carriers to invest in their networks. Number two, for device makers to invest in more technological sophisticatedness in their devices. These two things together, if you look over the arc of the last 20 years, is the reason why we're carrying miracles in our pockets and not just bricks that do only voice.
Because if the spectrum wasn't allocated that way, it wouldn't have given the incentives to these entrepreneurs the same way.
That's right.
So in just a couple minutes or less, how did it go from Coase's idea to actual auctions taking place?
Well, there was a competition of ideas there. It took a long time. Coase wrote his article in 1959.
Right.
There was 35 years between the time that he authored the piece and the time that auctions started at the Federal Communications Commission. Initially, the economics profession was not very welcoming of Coase's original idea. Even more so, the professionals inside the FCC itself were even less welcoming. It took a process of convincing the economics profession, of convincing the regulators that this idea was sound, not just in theory, but also in practice. And then finally, you mentioned the madmen in authority. This is a phrase that we take from John Maynard Keynes. It basically means those with their hands on the levers of the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. In the sports example, it was the NCAA Rules Committee. In this example, it is the regulators at the Federal Communications Commission. Now, in order for the change ultimately to happen, it had to be in the interests of the madmen in authority. Turns out, the auctions first happened when President Bill Clinton was in office. And as many people know, many of your viewers know, Bill Clinton was a deficit hawk. He ran for election on reducing the deficit. Well, guess what? These auctions brought in billions of dollars. And President Bill Clinton went to the FCC office and stood in front of one of those giant checks.
He likes big checks.
He likes big checks, and it was made out to the United States taxpayer for something on the order of $7 billion. And the memorable line from President Clinton was, "I'd go anywhere for a check this big."
I think that's a good note to end it on, Ed. Thank you for sharing with us
Absolutely,
today.
yeah.
Stick around because we have a great guest coming up next. His book sounds like the rules of kindergarten, but he spends his life trying to get the U.S. government to respect those simple rules. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Next time on Shakespeare Uncovered.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
Hugh Bonneville's favorite play, A Midsummer Night's Dream.
You're frightened of your inner fairy, are you?
One of the most sexually explicit and transgressive of plays.
But if you don't make an audience roar with laughter, you're not doing something right.
A Midsummer Night's Dream with Hugh Bonneville on Shakespeare Uncovered.
The wilds of planet Earth are spectacular. Yet one species is always framed out of the picture. Us. I'm Dr. M. Sanjan. My mission is to tell you an untold story, where we humans are not separate from nature. Oh! We are part of it.
Hold on, Betty.
What we think of as wild has actually, over centuries, been shaped by humans. I'm going to the frontiers of where man and animals meet. And here, I'm discovering just how much we need each other to survive. This is a place where elephants police rainforests, and man-eating tigers actually protect a nation of millions. Even the most unlikely creatures are crucial to our survival. It's all part of a vision I've seen emerging across this entire planet. A natural world tended by us, but that also supports us.
Coming out. Here it comes. Here it is.
Our home is changing. Now, there's a new kind of wild.
Next time on Shakespeare Uncovered.
Nothing will come of nothing.
Christopher Plummer explores the depths of King Lear.
The idea of what it might mean to lose your mind, to lose control, runs right through this play.
That's what King Lear is about, confronting the worst that is imaginable.
The Tragedy of King Lear with Christopher Plummer on Shakespeare Uncovered.
Joining me now is Matt Kibbe. Matt is president and CEO of FreedomWorks, a national grassroots organization that serves citizens in their fight for individual freedom and less government control. He's also author of the recent New York Times bestseller, Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. Matt, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
All right, well, you've got this book, Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. And this sounds like, common sense that any decent human being's mother would have taught them when they're growing up, but I'm looking at the cover of the thing, and you get a IRS 1040 form in the background, and I can't help but think the government takes my stuff all the time.
Indiscriminately, and I really, you mentioned kindergartners. I really wanted to make it simple enough so that a congressman could understand the ideas of liberty, and some people have said it's too simple, but we're in this monumental time right now when so many people are defining their own lives, whether it be through Uber or through Monster.com. They're self-educating online. They're setting up their own personal RSS feeds to get information. And yet the government, including the IRS, is centralizing things. They're trying to dictate speech. They're trying to determine what our health care is. And it's like this clash of the old system, the old top-down, one-size-fits-all, versus this new decentralized, you get to choose for yourself, freedom-based system.
Yeah, so ultimately, we used to have more of a freedom-based system. It became more central-based, and now there's this technological pushback. But I wonder, with your don't hurt people and don't take this is something everybody can agree with, but how come everybody just suspends this disbelief when they go into politics? And it's okay to hurt people and take their stuff. People just don't seem to see it that way. Well, if you ask them, is politics hurting people and taking their stuff? I bet you 99% of people watching would say no.
Yeah, it's funny because certainly government is all about power. It's a monopoly on force, and it's specifically designed to force people to do things that wouldn't do otherwise. But governments hurt people all the time, and big governments in particular, they get out of control, and the most murderous regimes in the history of the world were experiments in big government. But when it comes to, and everyone agrees that you shouldn't hurt other people, but when it comes to government, we sort of lose sight of that. The question of whether or not you should steal somebody else's stuff, that's what your mom told you. Don't steal. You wouldn't steal from a bank. You wouldn't steal your neighbor's stuff online. But why do we think it's okay to outsource stealing to a third party? Go vote for a congressman, and he can take money from somebody you don't know and give it to somebody else you don't know, presumably to make you feel better about some cause of social justice. I just don't understand the disconnect.
Yeah, I think it's a disconnect, but I think most people in society don't quite see it that way. And to me, it's a little bit bizarre. If you just had a random group of people and said, well, as a mob, as a riot, now the theft and breaking property became okay, most people would say, well, no, that's not true. But in a polity, they don't seem to see it that way. And what you're trying to do with this a little bit is make people more consistent in applying their moral rules that they do have across the board.
Yeah, and one of my favorite rules is take responsibility, and I came up with this rule reading an interview from Barack Obama in Rolling Stone magazine. He loves to set up straw men, and he was picking on Ayn Rand's version of individualism, suggesting that someone that believes in individual freedom really doesn't care about anybody or anything else and will do anything to get ahead. Well, that's just not true. It's a complete fabrication, because I always thought freedom was all about responsibility. You look yourself in the mirror in the morning. Did you get it done? If you didn't get it done, is it your fault first? That's how I think of individualism.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you're bringing this up, of course, because you were just in the recent movie that came out of Atlas Shrugged. You had a small part in that, right?
Yeah.
But this is a caricature that people say, oh, well, the Free Market Institute, which is one of the sponsors of this show, that, well, you just think the market will solve everything. And yeah, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff, trade on a voluntary basis, but that doesn't mean we have to do everything for profit. In fact, one thing I love about being in West Texas, there's a big individualist streak here, but it's not like the rugged individualist who cares for, it's like, this is a hard place to live, and it was only settled over a little over 100 years ago. So people got used to community, right? It's not a polar market or government, right?
Yeah. It takes a village, but I did a careful empirical analysis, and it turns up that villages are made up of individuals.
Oh, really?
You can't actually have one without the other.
Yeah. So basically, your take responsibility means when you see things that are people struggling in society or just social outcomes that other people would say we must turn to politics for. Your answer is? Yeah,
take responsibility. Think about it in the context of F.A. Hayek when he talked about the evolution of institutions and the way that all of these institutions constrain our behavior. It's how we solve problems simply by trying to figure things out, and you develop a division of labor, and various people come together and do something that's so much bigger than anyone of them could have done for themselves. Well, that's the description of the free market, but it's also the description of community. Mm-hmm. It's how we take care of each other when a neighbor is truly in need.
So in your view, let me just tell you, if someone said, you know what, all of this big welfare state that we have that provides aid for the elderly when they retire and Social Security, welfare for people who are more disadvantaged, unemployment insurance, all that. If we got rid of that, people would just be on the streets, Matt. You'd have your free market utopia and the world would suck.
Yeah, of course, people managed to help each other long before there was these fabulous programs, which were not only, it's not that they cost so much, it's that they don't work, but they're also an excuse for people not to take responsibility, to not get involved. If you outsource your compassion to Washington, D.C., you can always say, oh, they got that. I'm just going to ignore those problems. It doesn't work, and it's corrosive to the fabric that actually holds community together.
So you think, and actually historically, this is actually what we saw before the government got into all of these things. It was voluntary groups of citizens who helped them out. It was mutual aid societies, your civic associations, Elks Club wasn't just for hanging out and having beer. It was how you insured yourself against loss with your community. And for that matter, church groups, right? Would be, certainly here in West Texas, much more prevalent providers of these things, you think?
Yeah, but it was all local as well, and people knew each other by their names. They knew who was in trouble, and there was accountability on both sides of the cooperation equation.
So our first guest on the show today had talked about kind of social change dynamics. How do we reform our political systems? What's necessary in order to get slack in the system where entrepreneurs can move things? This is what your FreedomWorks group does, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So your last point here, you have the rules for liberty on the back of the book, and we've touched on a few of them, but number 6 is fight the power. What do you mean by fight the power, and how do you recommend average citizens participate in the political process?
The founders really...
We're going to put you up on top of the constitutional liberty there.
I think I'll gain some wisdom just by being in proximation there. But and of course, Public Enemy would be a little upset by this stack of books, but we'll put that aside for a different episode. The purpose of the American model is that the individual shareholder has both the ownership right in the American enterprise, but also a responsibility to keep Washington, D.C. in check. And a lot of us over the years were sort of rationally hoping that Washington, D.C. would just leave us alone. We didn't really want anything from Washington. We just wanted to raise our kids and do our jobs and work in our communities, and hoping that they would respect our individual rights. Well, in the meantime, all of these rent seekers and favor-seeking big interests all came to Washington, and they got something. And Washington is now out of control. It's this huge, powerful constituency that feels it's more important than we are. And the only way to solve that problem is to show up ourselves. You got to get involved.
So you guys don't run around writing a policy study and showing your congressman, hey, look, this would be good for America. What is it that you're doing instead to try to make America better or freer?
Organizing people. We're community organizers, much like the president is. We connect each other people with each other. We get them access to ideas, and we train them on how to be more effective in the public square. And maybe that's get out the vote, but more likely it's going to be at a town hall meeting or on the opinion pages of the local paper.
But this strikes me as I hadn't really thought of it before until you're saying this, is the American founding and the role of Sam Adams and the committees of correspondence were doing something similar, weren't they?
Very much. Sam Adams was the first community organizer, and he didn't organize at the university. He organized on the docks of Boston, and it was a bunch of workers believing in a set of ideas that were bigger than themselves and doing things that Barack Obama would argue is irrational because it wasn't in their immediate self-interest. It was for an idea that was bigger than they were.
Well, Matt, I thank you for sharing your ideas with us on liberty today, and wish you the best in continuing to promote them around the country.
We keep fighting the power.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Thanks for watching today. We were fortunate to have a scholar join us who's studying social change movements, and then a person who's actually got his boots on the ground and trying to make our country more free. I'll see you next time. Until then, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff.